Thank you everybody for joining us for another Africa Oil and Power and Africa Energy Chamber webinar. I'm going to wait just a couple minutes as participants are logging on, and then we'll get started. So just about one more minute. And just a quick reminder to the panelists to keep yourselves muted when you're not talking, just to kind of make sure that we don't have background noise while other people are talking. Okay, great. Let's get started. So my name is Katie Hurst. I'm with Africa Oil and Power. Thank you very much for joining us today on our webinar, Closing Deals, Advancing FID During COVID-19. We're very excited about this topic as companies, both large and small, are seeking the way forward for, during COVID and post-COVID environment, and as financing gets even more competitive. We're going to be talking about investment for large projects, for some mega deals. We're also going to be looking at what investment looks like for small and medium enterprises on the continent. Before we jump into that conversation and before I introduce my co-moderator, I'm just going to explain a couple housekeeping items. If everybody can look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat box. If you click on that chat box, you're welcome to discuss with each other some of the topics we're going to be talking about in the webinar. Make sure the "to" is addressed to all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, your message is just going to go to the panelists. If you can start out just sending a message in that chat box, your name, where you're from, what company you're with, just to get that conversation started. You'll also see a Q&A box. We are going to be taking questions during the webinar, so if you can submit your questions as you think of them, we'll be taking those as we go. So please use the Q&A box for your questions. And with that, I'm going to turn the webinar over to my co-moderator, Kwame Joanta, the Senior Vice President of the Freddie Jordan Oil Company in Ghana. And he is going to introduce our panelists and get our conversation started. Kwame?
Hello, Katie. Good afternoon, everyone. It's afternoon here in Accra, and I'm sure it's afternoon and evening in other countries, since we have a wide range of participants and those who are listening to us. As Katie said, my name is Kwame Joanta. I'm a lawyer by profession and Senior Vice President of Freddie Jordan. I'd like to start by introducing Marcia. Marcia Ashong is the founder and CEO of TheBoardroom Africa TBR and Braced Energy. TBR Africa, an initiative that champions women in executive leadership across Africa by working with venture capital and private equity investors, development finance institution, companies and organizations across the continent to improve female representation in boardrooms and investment committees. Marcia is also a lawyer by profession. I move on to Arron. Dr. Arron Singhe is an oil and gas expert and key advisor to African countries on policies and strategies to maximize the benefits of exploitation of their petroleum resources. He currently serves as Chief Oil Sector Officer at the African Development Bank and has previously held technical, managerial, and business development positions in research institutions, petroleum industry, and strategic management consulting. He also has qualifications in engineering and oil and gas management from Robert Gordon University. Our last panelist is Paul Eardley-Taylor. He's responsible for Standard Bank's oil and gas sector coverage activities for Southern Africa. It covers 11 countries across upstream, midstream, downstream services and process industry clients. Paul has 20 years of energy, corporate and investment banking experience, covering the oil and gas, power and utilities, and renewables and carbon subsectors, and has been based in Africa for the last 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, these are our panelists. Right. I would like us not to have a discussion, but to have a conversation in these COVID days. And hopefully it won't be COVID years. We'll be able to get over some of the challenges that we are facing and what that the oil industry is also facing. The energy sector has particularly been hit hard with COVID. You can see the plummeting of the oil price and the impact of that plummeting on industry. Our questions will be covering an overview of the oil industry with COVID, covering investment and also African companies. So if I may start with Paul, in your broad overview, how do you think Africa's financing and energy sectors have been impacted by COVID? How do you see it?
Thank you very much for the question. I think the first one we'd say is there's definitely been a difference between oil and gas globally. It may be energy transition related, but across the two spaces, there's been a different reaction. Oil, the process is well known. COVID has really affected mobility. Demand dropped as low as 72 million barrels in April, down 28%. And most analysts reckon it could get back to the early 90s by year end. Bizarrely, in the world of LNG, things have been a bit different. As of last week's IEA report, in the year to May, LNG demand was up 8.5% year on year globally, which is an astonishing achievement. So really starting to see the difference between the two. And that's feeding through to Africa. On a headline basis, the answer can be reasonably gloomy. If you look at, say, a WoodMac study, they'll say up to about 21 FIDs are expected, broadly speaking, this year, next year. That may drop as low as 3. However, WoodMac are obviously working off public domain, and on the private domain, plus also on the news flow that's starting to come through. The world, and certainly the world that Standard Bank sees, is a little bit more optimistic than the gloomy side of life. To give you an example, which is obviously pretty public, the financing of Mozambique LNG is very near to signature. That's been largely disclosed in the public domain, and that number will be on or around $15 billion. For an African project to raise $15 billion of debt, which is the same as the country's GDP in the middle of COVID, and with Brent now only just exceeding $40, it's an astonishing achievement. So I think the message from our side is that whilst part of April was extremely gloomy, things are starting to look better, and no material second wave occurring. The world from an energy perspective could hopefully be right-sized by the end of the year, and hopefully 2021 will be Africa's 2020.
So Paul, tell me, when you look at the value chain being oil and gas, including power, because when you look at the gas, once gas moves from FPSO and gets into the processing plant, it comes into downstream. How do you see that? Do you see a challenge with the power side? Do you see a similar challenge with the oil and gas side? And which one do you think would have more impact on Africa?
Yeah, one of the great challenges of African energy has been the lack of creditworthiness of African utilities. That's a well-known theme. And for example, the average African power utility is less creditworthy than a phone company. That's extremely well known and has been. I guess the major challenge with COVID affecting African economies, and slight reduction in growth is expected this year, 3%, something like that, is the creditworthiness of those power utilities is only going to decline further because the underlying sovereign has come down. So that really says, well, either you need different ways of introducing financing mechanisms into power. For example, do you have prepay and so on? Do you have decentralized energy where communities will buy PV? Or my own personal favorite is, given the sheer speed at which LNG is becoming available in the African market and the ability for small-scale LNG, it's a good opportunity to reduce the purchase of HFO and diesel and look to move towards cleaner fuel consumption, which also offers climate change benefits as well.
Okay. I'll come to you, Arron, and you seem to sit bang on in the middle where ADB is concerned. ADB seems to be doing quite a lot in Africa with regards to energy. So what do you think are some of the strategies going forward within the sector where financing is concerned?
Yes, thank you very much for these questions. The financing of energy in Africa has to be seen in two perspectives. The one I will not touch here is the perspective of renewable energy, where African Development Bank and most of the MDBs are very keen to put the money now. I will rather look at the fossil fuel sector, the fossil energy sector, the oil and gas sector, where I can make justice. The first thing in the oil and gas sector financing is the competition of renewable energy. The climate change that has come into play now, that is really constraining the financial capabilities of the oil and gas companies, which have been complexed by the COVID-19 that we are living now. The COVID-19 has, to say, an amplifying effect on the financial constraint of the oil and gas project. Then we can see it. It is true that the Mozambique project, as Paul rightly mentioned, is still attracting the kind of $15 billion of financing. But ExxonMobil also, in another project in Mozambique, has delayed green light for $30 billion project. So this has to send a signal to the oil and gas industry in Africa that the paradigm is changing. As the paradigm is changing, we need as an industry to review the way with which we are developing the project in terms of the new externalities that have come in and are playing a more important role, which are the socio-economic externalities and the environmental externalities. This will influence, beyond COVID-19, this will influence a lot financial flow in the oil and gas industry in Africa in the future. This means that we have to go back to the fundamentals. Government and the private sector, government and investors need to collaborate. I wouldn't like to focus much on COVID-19 because we still, COVID-19 for the oil and gas industry so far is more an event, like some other events that have occurred in the oil and gas industry. The main threat to the oil and gas industry actually at the moment is climate change and energy transition. So yes, the COVID will have the effect. We call them on the government to collaborate with the private sector to find solutions, including all other stakeholders, meaning the financial institution, the multilateral development banks, and other partners who are having new criteria in funding oil and gas projects. Then we should consider to, as government in Africa, that the overarching principle of oil and gas projects is also the balancing of the risk and reward. Now we have the environmental risk that has to be considered more than ever, and that will shape the financial strategies and financial flow in the oil and gas industry in Africa in the future. Thank you.
When you talk about collaboration, what kind of collaboration are you looking for? Is it collaboration to do with the kind of regulation in place? Is it collaboration of making sure that you have adequate financing for some of, especially the local companies? What kind of collaboration do you talk about? Because we find more and more that capacity is very, very difficult where some of these companies are concerned. So if you can give me an example of the kind of collaboration you want to see between governments and the oil companies, because sometimes most governments, politicians at that, do not understand the industry that well.
Thank you very much. I come back to the principle of the oil and gas investment. When an investor comes to a country, the main objective of the investor generally is to increase shareholders' value to maximize his profit. The country wants also to derive maximum benefit from the final resources. And in this game, how do we put the pieces of the puzzles together so that the two parties are contented? So it is a game. So what will the government do now? Knowing that the market is shifting. The market is shifting gradually towards to benefit the investors, because it's difficult for African countries now to have the stance that Nigeria would have. Like one, we take an example, let's say 20 years ago, because there are other producing countries, even within Africa and elsewhere, who are offering better conditions. I'm talking of regulatory conditions. If you have a certain predictable regulatory framework, predictable and stable political system in place, and you have a stable tax system, a predictable tax system in place, which takes into consideration the fact that along the line, these are long-term investments, along the line, we need to be rebalancing risk and reward, not only to the benefit of the investor, but also to the benefit of the state. This has been an issue with the recent Nigeria tax claim. We need to review and renegotiate certain provision of the Production Sharing Agreement Act. So this is becoming very important and crucial to attract investment in the oil and gas sector. And with the COVID-19 immediate response, some African states have understood it and have brought immediate response to the COVID, in order not to terminate, to encourage oil and gas company to remain into business, delay financial closure or delay final decision to invest or financial commitment. So there are a lot of measures that some states have taken in order to encourage investors first to stay now. So, and another collaboration will be encouraging, making it easy now for companies to farm out, encourage consolidations within the government, listening to other stakeholders in order to find a common understanding or a common intersection where to do business profitably for all the parties, but also encouraging and making it easy for the party to share risk on their own side and attract more financing. To go to the side of the local content side and local companies, talking of in-country value addition, government at the moment, government in African countries also have to stand at the moment for African SMEs. Encourage not only collaboration amongst those SMEs, but also joint ventures. Looking at the regional perspective is also important. But for the moment, they need to survive. They need their government interventions in order to provide them with the required liquidity to continue business. How they do it? So we need a conversation between these companies, the government, and the jobs providers, which is the industry. That's where you see bringing all of them together, the financial institution to talk to and find solutions to progress and find solutions to sustainable solution. Not only now because COVID-19 has taught us a lot of lessons on domesticating of knowledge, a domestication of services, and the fragility of the oil and gas sector.
Right.
As exposed. Thank you.
All right, Arron.
Great. And Marcia, I think,
yeah, go on.
I was going to say, Marcia, I think you had some things you wanted to say on this topic as well.
Yes, I just wanted to come to Marcia because it falls right in the lap of what you do. So take it from there.
So I don't think I would reiterate what some of the other panelists have said regarding the impact of COVID-19 and the oil sectors in particular. But I believe they're in a much better position than I am to give a more in-depth insight. Although I have a long history in oil and gas, I've spent majority of my most recent career doing many other exciting things, as well as some of my newer ventures, more impact oriented. But I will say this, we are in very uncharted waters, and I often cringe at those who compare what we're going through now with previous economic downturns. This is unlike anything we've experienced, at least in my lifetime. Take, for instance, the fact that the IMF is estimating a 3% reduction in global GDP for 2020 to a roughly 0.1 GDP reduction during the 2008 financial crisis. The effect is almost tripled, and you know, this is not going anywhere. Also, the fact that Africa remains largely a commodity-based economy is at the heart of why this double threat is particularly detrimental to our economy. So while the effect of coronavirus might not cause as much of a public health burden as it was first envisaged, although I think the jury is still out on that, it would likely have a worse economic impact in our parts. Let's also not forget the fact that raw materials make up a third of Africa's export income, and that those that depend on these, where in some part a large chunk of our income are dependent on export of these goods, the road to recovery will be extremely slow and arduous. And I can even argue that the full effect of COVID-19 in our economies, even beyond oil and gas, is not fully recognized yet. Now, from the oil and gas perspective in particular, obviously, as some of my colleagues, panelists have already suggested, the resulting reduction in demand for oil in regards has led to a drastic reduction in FIDs, derailing some major projects. One in particular is the ACA's decision in Ghana to postpone further work on its pecan discovery. In some respects, the supply chain disruptions have also played a role in the postponement and the cancellation of some of these major projects. Well, in part because of some of these restrictions have stalled equipment mobilization. We are all well aware of the fact that our manufacturing capabilities in Africa are subpar, especially in oil and gas industry. So imagine the effect that this has had on mobilizing tools and equipment to the continent, and a task which prior to COVID-19 was difficult, but has been further compounded. And finally, I also want to briefly touch on the topic of M&As, because I think this is another area in which the pandemic is also changing the way in which this particular trend is emerging. During a typical downturn, say for instance, the oil price slump from 2014 onwards, we often saw a scramble for assets. That is because at that stage, company valuations are at their lowest. So that was a time where companies would see most viable option to acquire. But this time around, the trend is quite the opposite. The companies that will most likely be acquirers, such as major oil companies and or large integrated international IOCs, face several more challenges beyond just being able to acquire cheaper assets. They already have been put in place disposal programs to meet cost reduction targets. They face severe constraints on their capital, and their dwindling cash reserves are being prioritized for dividend payments. And I guess more importantly, their acquisition targets are also not as attractive as we would have wished them to be. So in sum, I'd say that we're definitely in uncharted waters. We can talk about the effects of the downturn is having now on the economy, but I strongly believe that the real effects are yet to be fully captured. And it is only when we start to bring our economies back from the brink that we will see the true extent of the damage that this has caused. And I strongly believe, as you know, we were discussing earlier, Kwame, that this is not what's happening to the sector is not purely a sector-induced issue. It's simply as a result of the pandemic we find ourselves in. And so moving forward, knowing that we will likely have these pandemics constantly occurring, what is it that we are doing as an industry to really prepare for this new normal, i.e. these things will come up again and again and again. So how are we restructuring, rethinking, and really thinking innovatively about how we orient the industry?
Marcia, tell me, we're talking of two different sides here, aren't we? We're talking of offshore, where the impact is hardest. If we look at onshore, would you say the impact is equal? Or would you say where onshore is concerned, SMEs have a much better chance in terms of even getting financing because of the kinds of investment that is required for offshore exploration?
Yeah, I think, pretty much that question has been answered. And I guess, again, I'm not sure I'm the best position to answer this, as I'm kind of,
well, because you deal with a lot of SMEs.
Right, exactly. As I don't follow these trends specifically with regards to onshore, offshore, but I will say this. Any operation that requires heavy capital outlays is going to be drastically affected, especially where it involves the movement of specific goods and services. And we know that those specific goods and services are going to be drastically affected because of the supply chain strangles that we have right now. Now, in terms of support for local entities, whether it's SMEs or any other onshore activity, where I see the biggest issue right now is just being able to stay afloat. And so most companies are now switching to retrenching back to just basic services, getting rid of employees, having to renegotiate terms with existing contractors or even subcontractors, thinking about ways to really stay through this really tough periods. And I find that those relief efforts that have, in some cases, availed themselves are very much not enough to sustain some of the troubles that SMEs are facing. And these are SMEs, whether they are oil and gas companies or non-oil and gas companies, everybody's really suffering through this period. And so what I find and what I have observed mostly is companies going back to their basic business continuity plans, looking at ways that they can survive through this period, whether it means accessing loans that give them better approaches to riding through the wave, or looking at alternative ways of staying afloat. I've seen leaders slash their salaries. I've seen them getting rid of, I mean, I've been in the industry, I was in the industry when the 2014 downturn happened in the oil sector, and within just a few months, we went from elaborate plans for workforce mobilization and to really just retrenching and just getting rid of as many people as possible. Thousands and thousands of employees just either being furloughed or laid off. So it's a dire time. I think, you know, in the US market, I think there's even more suffering going on there. Some of the markets here have been slightly shielded from the full effects, again, because of the public healthcare concern here hasn't been as much of a burden as it has in other parts of the globe. But like I said, moving forward, we really don't know the full effects until we wait.
Okay, and just a point of development, especially with the ACA situation in Ghana. They have reached an agreement where they decided to phase in their development, which I guess is better than what they were planning on doing. But you know, we have an interactive discussion here, and one of the panelists, Katie Brock, has asked a question, and it goes to all panelists, and she's asking, what characteristics will make oil and gas projects more competitive for funding and reaching FID? Paul, I'll start with you.
Sorry, I was on mute. I think Arron made a very good point, which is about optimizing projects for the energy transition. And what we're clearly seeing is that if your project is squarely in the energy transition, at worst it will be delayed a year or so, but there's no reason to stop it going ahead. Mozambique is the case in point where even the Exxon project is widely expected to go ahead next year once it's secured a cheaper EPC price, and certainly the demand for LNG has continued unabated. So I guess the more interesting question is, of the projects which were traditionally funded in Africa and are in the sort of headlights of the energy transition, to what extent can they still be achievable and fundable? and so far there's sort of mixed evidence, but you know, a good example of what's happened despite COVID, despite the pricing challenges, is really the Ugandan case, where over the last couple of months there's been good movement and momentum in Uganda, alignment between the stakeholders and the lead sponsor Total. Total in turn has purchased Tullows' interest, and its partner decided not to enforce its preemption rights, so Total is thoroughly in charge of the project. And there's every expectation that even an onshore oil project with a long ride to the coast may well take FID in the sort of the coming months and year. So I guess the implication is that if you have strong sponsors with underlying good fundamentals, and of course the project has been developed in exactly the right way, in accordance with the Equator Principles and other sort of international standards, and then those projects are still expected to go ahead. But conversely, there are still a few areas where players are looking to rationalize their portfolios and downsize in particular countries on the continent.
Arron? Arron? Arron, hello?
Arron, can you hear us?
Can you hear us? You might not. Yes, okay. So can you contribute to that question that was asked by Katie Brock?
Yes, I will first of all align with Paul and add to it that today we need to make sure in Africa that we have really strong IOCs or financiers of the project. You could see that now with the COVID-19. Only these companies with bigger muscles are resilient to the crisis. And although they are reducing their expenditures drastically, they still find ways to invest into projects where they see the value, whether fiscal value, financial value, or strategic value coming immediately. That's why we are happy about the $15 billion of total in Mozambique. It means that when the fundamentals of the project are strong and the sponsors have the financial power themselves or to leverage from the market, the project have high chance. Coming to the African country, there are many African countries where you have smaller companies. You have independent companies, and with these companies, in face of a crisis like COVID-19, fought with the uncertainties, because unlike other crises like the 2014 crisis, when the oil price also fell for at least 3 years, the COVID-19 comes with a lot of uncertainties going forward. So what are the companies that can really absorb and manage this risk? It is these companies that can do. And when I spoke about the energy transition side of the project, this is for the weaker companies who I need to facilitate getting financial support from the international market. Because today, with the Paris Agreement and the commitment to nationally determined contributions that all countries, all African countries have agreed, it is very important for investors, even private investors nowadays in oil, so to say, countries like the US, looking at the environmental stewardship in the project. How much is your project contributing to preserving the environment and to combat climate change? How does it benefit the economy? How does it benefit to the people of your country? These are the two main externalities that strengthen the fundamentals of the new projects today and give weaker investors leverage on the capital market. Thank you.
Okay, Marcia. Yeah.
Also add to that briefly, and also this is dovetailing from a question I think Eureka is asking about kind of lean management models in with larger companies. In my view, the industry really needs to build back better. We need to envisage a new world we find ourselves in where economic volatility will become the order of the day, and re-envision the way we structure our companies and institutions. I've been saying this for a long time because I've been through periods where, you know, things are great and then things kind of take a downturn and everybody in the organization is starting to scramble. I've worked for major multinationals and see this over and over again. I think we should start to think outside the box. What's the relevance of a large integrated operation in the sector? The period will present itself a new set of opportunities for changing, I think, the global oil and gas business. I'm talking about innovation, and I don't mean innovation in tools and equipment or innovation in lip service. I'm talking about fundamentally new way of doing business, new ideas, and instead of growing larger companies through mergers and acquisitions, I'm talking of more competitive, which create competitive bottlenecks. The industry must learn to divest of itself of costly business units which erode margins. For instance, must company X be involved in all aspects of service provision? Why are we continuing to do this multi-layer integrations? What's the cost of full integration? This requires, I think, some sort of strategic thinking on parts of executives that I think is not being done, especially at the large oil and gas company level. You know, because I think shareholder return is a major, you know, thing across the industry. And while I understand that, I think we lose the bigger picture of how the industry can really come out of this, you know, and I agree with Arron's point on how do we start to build in more sustainable models of project development? How do we start to think about utilizing local capacity to really do things that need to be done without having to, you know, keep compounding on the cost imperative that the companies have to deal with. So from my perspective, I think is really about you know, putting ourselves in a position where we say, are oil and gas companies, especially the larger ones, are they efficient business models, and what types of structures we would need to change those business models?
So, Marcia, if we concentrate more on local companies and we look at the two areas, mature countries in oil and gas and nascent countries in oil and gas. In terms of the mature countries, you've got capacity building, which seems to be going on. So you compare Nigeria to Ghana, and we are nowhere near it. Compare Angola to probably Equatorial Guinea, they're nowhere near it. How do you see it, especially with capacity building? Because if COVID is going to allow us to look at things differently, how do we cover that area of capacity building, which we're even struggling with now for SMEs and local companies that want to get into the industry?
So my honest view is that we structure local content rules quite wrongly. And I say that because I've been on the side of the ones helping with policy development. I've been on the side of those in the industry who are having issues with how local content rules are developed, because I honestly don't believe that those rules are deriving as much value as they claim to be, to wanting to derive. And the reason why I say that is because value has now shifted to those at the top. You know, if you have the capacity, and I'm using Ghana and maybe a few other countries who have similar local content rules as an example. Local content rules are designed in part for those who have access to resources and tools. And if that's going to be the mainstay, then you're not really thinking about full local utilization of services and products. What you're doing is you're essentially saying that I'm creating an environment where the best can thrive, or where those that have resources already can thrive. And for me, that's what's really stalling development. I mean, that's coupled with all the other governance issues that we have on the continent, really creating rules that say we're doing one thing, and on the other hand, they have a completely separate effect. I honestly believe, and I've been saying this from day one, that no, besides the, you know, too big to fail type entities that are coming along and the consistent need to integrate, besides that, which causes a lot of problems, I think, in the industry, oil and gas companies actually do want to provide local value because it makes business sense. But I find that local content rules stall their progress in that regard. And I can agree that in some countries like Nigeria, historically, that hasn't been the case. But if you're talking about a company that needs to really reduce its access to it reduces cost exposure. The main way of doing so is being able to attract local services, being able to employ locally, being able to manufacture locally, and so on and so forth. So the real question, I think, is what are governments doing to create an enabling environment where these companies want to do this without being compelled to do it? And I think that's where the bridge and the failure in this development of local capacity lies. Is these companies, so for instance, my previous company didn't have any manufacturing capacity on the continent. And there's no incentive from this government which claims to want to create a hub for oil and gas activity. There's no incentive for company A to come and develop manufacturing capacity in my country. And the manufacturing capacity in my country has to make sense, not just for my country, but it has to make sense for all other neighboring countries. I must be able to transfer my goods from Ghana to Nigeria, or Ghana to Ivory Coast, or Ghana to you name it. And even that, I mean, if I want equipment from Nigeria or Lagos or Port Harcourt, you name it, to Accra, the time in which it takes me, I was country manager of my previous company in Ivory Coast, and I can speak to this because I have firsthand experience of wanting to take goods, materials, equipment from Nigeria or from Angola to Accra. And the time and effort and struggle I have to go through to do that versus having to go from the UK or Germany or Aberdeen or you name it. So it's really about the enabling environment that we create in transportation bottlenecks, supply chain bottlenecks. Those are all of the things that are causing companies to really struggle with building local capacity on the continent.
Katie, did you have a question to come into?
I did, yeah. So switching a little bit and going back to Paul, we have, at least to start, we have a couple questions coming in from the audience related more to fiscal incentives. And I'm going to actually kind of combine two of our questions. We have a question from Irene asking, do you foresee a number of countries offering additional fiscal incentives to aid project development? And then Thomas is asking, given the higher level of risk carried by low oil prices and an uncertain future, should we design financing models involving more companies to alleviate the level of risk? So kind of combining those two concepts and looking at risk in a project, what kind of things can governments be doing to mediate that risk? And what can companies themselves be doing, whether it's partnering with each other or partnering with more financial institutions?
Yeah, just one comment on Marcia's observations though. I think a lot of the points she was referring to are really trade points more than local content. And one would hope that something like ACFTA will address that in time. Local content, the prescriptive models that have been put down, that's one model. There's other models too. Mozambique is essentially bilaterally negotiating local content on a deal-by-deal basis, but we'll see which works. On the fiscal point, absolutely, that's going to come through. A good example of this is Angola, where Angola essentially moved down that route about 2-3 years ago. It did it explicitly with the marginal fields terms. It also did it explicitly with the gas law. And our general understanding, as confirmed in the public domain, is that on a case-by-cases for particular fields, individual concessions have been able to have amended fiscal terms. And if you see over the last year, block 15, 17, 18, essentially on 3 different concessions that were moving from a sort of midlife crisis into maturity, Angola did a blend and extend, where in essence, for getting a longer contractual term for the concession, a percentage of equity was given to Sonangol that they previously didn't have. So the fiscal thing is absolutely going to move. It's all about what is the target market an individual company and a country is looking to develop, taking account of the energy transition, as has been mentioned, and other computing projects. On financial models, we often hear a lot of this and see a lot of this. I think the couple that are really moving along quite quickly. And I'm going to get slightly out of my comfort zone because I'm going back into power, which I haven't done for 10 years. But certainly clean energy bonds and decentralized energy, they are getting an awful lot of attention from my colleagues in the space, especially for PV in Africa. So I think that's got a long way to go in terms of movement. I think the other one is also with technology moving quite quickly in oil and gas, and here I'm thinking specifically FSRUs, FSUs, small scale LNG, you're going to get a lot more crossover in the realms of oil and gas and transportation, to give you one example. And literally just today, there's a good example of that in South Africa, where one of the small juniors, Renogen, has announced a deal with Total around LNG transportation on one of the country's main highways. So those sorts of models, I think, are probably the best answer I can give to the questioner at this time.
Great. And then kind of looking at this idea of, you know, multiple companies maybe coming together. Marcia, is this something you can speak on? Like, I think a concern right now for African companies is that, you know, they might get eaten up in this, right? As larger companies are going to have a bit more of a advantage, right? As you're dealing with all of the budget sheets and whatnot. How do you see, you know, African companies cooperating to get through this environment?
Oh, it's a good question. And if I'm taking this as a whole, I think, first of all, African company, you know, this is a time more than ever to live up to the mantra of made in Africa. This whole situation we find ourselves in is not only detrimental to the large institutions, but smaller companies, SMEs, you name it, are having to suffer through it. And they're suffering through it and literally being left behind. So my perspective is, why don't we all take a new approach to what it is that we need to be able to do locally to survive through this wave, but also to prepare ourselves for future wave disruptions. I'm not sure exactly what two companies can come together and do, because obviously the idea behind it may be competition. They're both in a competitive environment. But I'm thinking about what can local companies do to leverage on local goods and services. And I agree with Paul in part on his comments about the issues with local content development that I mentioned were largely as a result of trade. But I think it goes beyond that. Just because of my own personal experience, it goes beyond that to where, you know, putting in place appropriate sector development initiatives that are responsive and not just, you know, copy paste measures, but are really responsive to the needs of the companies that are concerned. And I know currently what we're doing, several governments have availed various stimulus programs to support companies that are struggling through these times. And those are good in and of themselves, but I don't think they go as deep as they need to go, although to what extent do our governments have the leverage and the resources to be able to do more is also a question that we should ask. But some of these efforts are really around, you know, building and creating stimulus around, you know, finding companies that can sustain loan initiatives. And frankly, not all companies can. I mean, yes, maybe some oil and gas companies who have demonstrated value and been able to attract projects in the past can show a track record. But for a great majority of companies who are not in this position, what other relief efforts are there? And I think, you know, for me, it's looking at holistically what we can do nationally, but also what we can do on a Pan-African level, recognizing that, you know, it's not enough to just ride the wave, but it's critical that we come out of this, and in some regards, anti-fragile. And anti-fragile literally just means we come out of this stronger than we went into it. And I'm suspecting that we're not fully recognizing what that entails. And frankly, the question as to what that entails is one that is, I think, more difficult than I think I'm making it sound. However, I do believe that there's a lot of things that we can do as companies who are on this continent trying to survive. There's a lot we can do to really recognize the fact that local value derivation is critical. And how do we compel governments to also see this is the question.
Great. And Arron, do you have anything on these issues of, adapting fiscal incentives or de-risking through cooperation?
Thank you. Yes, cooperation indeed. I will jump first on the local content issue raised by Marcia, and before I get to the cooperation amongst the firms. The local content is a long achievement of a significant level of local content is a long-term venture. And many African countries, especially new and emerging producers, developed local content policies and enacted local content laws in a copy and paste manner without looking at the fundamentals of local content. In this respect, we have a lot of incoherencies among the policies, amongst the regulations, and amongst the laws. And these incoherencies stem from the absence of, first of all, a baseline assessment of the country itself in terms of the local content requirements. Employment, local contracts to service companies, local supplies. What are the requirements? What is my human capital development index when I start the local content of oil and gas industry, which is a highly regulated industry and which is an industry with high standard of quality and safety. So we fail to start from the national development policy. The national development policy should include local content, not only for the oil and gas industry. The local content of the oil and gas industry will just be as a branch of that national content policy, because the oil and gas industry, for it to really create linkages and develop local content, should cooperate with other industries in the country. It makes no sense to say that in 10 years, I need 50% of the supplies in share from locals, where the fundamentals are not addressed. Have I worked on the local capacity to supply? What is my educational system? Is it capable to follow? My local financing system, are the people, is it easy to access finance?
Yeah.
So these are the fundamentals where I agree with Marcia that in this context, we need a more collaborative approach and a more incentivized local content, more than incentives are better than coercions at this level, because no matter how much policing you will bring, if there is a rule or a regulation, if there is a requirement that is not possible to meet by a company, I will tell you, I looked for the qualified supplier in the market. I didn't find any. I had to source from abroad. This is what we often see. And to add to this is that the operationalization also of local content has to be collaborative approach involving all the stakeholders, especially the civil society, which can stand as a whistleblower for political economy effect. Because we also see that in many African countries, this is what Marcia tried to refer to, the opportunities are politically linked. So, so long as the real business are not getting access to the opportunities, the idea of cooperating or collaborating among companies to be stronger or to have better leverage in the financial market will be defeated, because the most important obstacle to local companies is actually access to the jobs. Because financial institutions are there, some of them are there to support them. There are other financial channels created by government to support SMEs that apply to them, but companies can spend 2-3 years without having a job. And when they look for bigger tickets, the job giver is asking for track records. How will I develop track record in 3 years when I don't have access to jobs? And we keep on spinning around this circle on, and in the end, we have the same say. We looked for a competent supplier. We couldn't find one in the market. So government also, the industry, the financial institution, and all stakeholders have to understand that local content and collaboration amongst local companies, local suppliers will be key to derive benefit from the exploitation of the oil and gas resources of this country beyond the rent. So it is an investment both for companies and the government, because COVID-19 taught us that if we had local suppliers for certain special goods or services, the companies themselves would have suffered less disruption caused by international supply chains. So we need, it is more than ever important to look into domesticating skills, domesticating technology, and that takes us to the innovative collaboration patterns to reduce cost and encourage technology development and technology acquisition. Excuse me, I personally don't like using the term of technology transfer. I prefer using the term of technology acquisition, because an encourage technology acquisition, we need to develop joint venture and strategic alliancing. Strategic alliancing has shown in many other oil and gas provinces to reduce costs and accelerate development of local suppliers. And companies like Shell, Total, BP have played a very big role in that. So we can also apply it in the African market. And we need the policy side, the regulatory side, and the business side to make it happen. Thank you.
Okay, Katie. So let me ask the last question because of time, and it has to be short answer. It has to be a short answer, and I want everybody to give their piece on it. From what Arron has just said, and with Africa's 1.2 billion people, is it time to have a paradigm shift in terms of adding value to our natural resources instead of exporting out? Have we gotten there now in order to be thinking outside the box? looking at the kind of population Africa is going to have in the next 10 to 20 years? We'll start with you, Paul.
In the short term, guys have to be extremely careful about how they answer the question and analyze the resources before we move to an Africa of 20 years' time. Just to give you a basic gas example, 1,000 megawatt power plant, and not too many African markets need 1,000 megawatt power plants, needs about 150 to 170 scuffs a day, gas feedstock. Mozambique LNG is one example. 2,000 comes out the ground, 2,000 scuffs to produce 12.9 million tons of LNG every day. You are simply not able to justify offshore developments of cleaner energy that can supply millions of people around the world, including Africans, without a solid, robust customer market. So just that one equation on its own should give you a sign of how long the journey will take. The journey is a good journey. Small-scale LNG is a way to get there in the example I've given, but one has to be realistic about what the African energy market can take on its own right, how it will pay for it, and where the money is coming from to bridge that journey. But the underlying objective is absolutely laudable, but it will take time.
Marcia?
Well, I completely agree with Paul. It's about certain realistic project scopes and certain realistic timelines and certain realistic goals. And I think more importantly, it's also about thinking about what are some of the gaps that we have in not only in our knowledge, but in our capacity. And does it make sense to import knowledge and capacity, or does it make sense to build those knowledge and capacity in-house? And I think oftentimes when we talk about deriving local value, we think that necessarily means that we have to turn every raw material into a finished good. But I think that is critical, and I think we must start to do that more often. But I think it's also about how well we leverage our resources to get the best out of it. Lots of countries across the globe, you know, have raw materials that they also kind of ship out and or export, but it's the way in which they do it that derive the highest value. So from my perspective, it's about looking at the best way to derive value. I mean, and that's not just in oil and gas industry, that cuts across all sectors, especially where agri is concerned, which is growing, coming up to be one of the major industries of focus, especially during this period and post COVID-19. What does it mean to be a fully integrated agri sector? What does it mean for us to build in the relevant tools and resources that we need to turn raw materials into finished goods? And that's the same with oil and gas. Oil and gas is one of those sectors that require heavy capital outlays. Does it make sense to say everybody can participate? No. But what does it mean for you as an oil producing country to be able to, as Arron said, build in backward and forward linkages such that you are making real value out of the product that you are producing, not just for those that work in the industry, but for other sectors as well. And I don't think we've fully leveraged on those opportunities. So from my perspective, I remain optimistic, although I sound quite pessimistic. I remain optimistic about the future that we have, but I think moving forward, there has to be thinking, real paradigm shift, as he said, in our way of thinking about what value means. And value means so many different things.
Lastly, Arron?
Thank you. This is a very interesting question, a very interesting topic. Let me say it like this. Indeed, there has to be a paradigm shift in terms of how resources are exploited on the African continent. And but this wouldn't go without understanding the national politics of the natural resources and the international geopolitics and the market itself. So with this in mind, and bearing in mind the abject energy poverty that Africa is in at the moment, and the fast progress that renewable energy is having in the energy mix today, and the favorable policies towards development of renewable energy and the need to embark onto low carbon pathway and get to greener economy need to be considered and shape the way in Africa we have to think of maximizing the value of our natural resources. And what is the value then in this context? For oil and gas, the topic for oil and gas particularly, we have to look at it in twofold. The first one, a new country in the oil and gas or an established producer wanting to develop new field or exploring new resources. The first question is in this country, what am I going to do with the new resources? What is the prospect of asset stranding when I'm investing in these resources? How long am I going to exploit these resources? Do I intend to build an oil and gas industry? Yes. If I want to build an oil and gas industry, I have to build the value chain, the complete value chain, exploration and production, refining, transportation, and distribution. How long will it take me to develop a full-fledged oil and gas industry? It brings us back to the question and the conundrum that we have in East Africa with Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, South Sudan. So this is very important now. It's a very important question in Africa. Do I have to build a refinery when I'm opening an oil field, or do I have to look at spare capacity that may exist elsewhere where I can shift my oil to be refined, or do we have to think to build a regional refinery to minimize the cost and make sure that what is invested is quickly recouped? Because the big oil may not be tomorrow, but it is uncertain. We can't say. So in these circumstances, what a country, new producers or existing producers should endeavor to do is not basically just to build an oil and gas value chain for maximum value recovery, but it's more to look at how the resources exploited can be used to diversify the economy, bringing us back to local content and domestic linkages. How quickly can I use my resources to diversify my economy? This means that I need to think of provision of supply electricity to the people to power the industry, the agricultural industry, and other sectors of the economy. So I need to use the oil and gas and other chemicals to produce fertilizers for agriculture. I need to use the oil and gas industry to support research and development in other sectors, thinking of technology acquisition there and technology spillover in other sectors. Collaborate with university properly for knowledge to be built locally and be used for other sectors of the economy. These may be non-tangible values that we may not be seeing, but these values are very important for economic diversification in the fossil fuel with leveraging the fossil fuel sector. And this is where I personally see the paradigm change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to say thank you so much to our panelists today and to Kwame for moderating this discussion. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. I just want to remind everybody that we have a webinar next week, The Pathway to Grid Stability, Increased Capacity in a Diversified Angolan Economy. Again, thank you very much to all, and everybody have a great rest of your day. I hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.